Hi. Never been here before. I'm very glad that you invited me to come here. Very honored to be able to speak at the Ronald Reagan Library to help discuss a worthy successor to him. I believe that American politics and global politics has fundamentally changed this year and has very little in common with any of the politics that preceded it. The two-party system in this country is not breaking down, it will continue, but there will be radically redefined political parties. The Democratic Party will be different and the Republican Party will be different. Because in both parties, the membership, the rank and file, the grassroots, if you will, overthrew the party leadership in the primaries. In the Republican primary, Bush and Rubio and Christie and all of the sort of establishment candidates fell apart. And the two candidates who challenged the establishment most directly, Trump and Cruz, won the nomination with almost 2/3 of the Republican voters voting for them. Donald Trump didn't so much win the Republican primary as he took over the Republican Party and defeated it in a Republican primary. He literally defeated the party in its own primary. And Bernie Sanders came within 4 points of doing that, with 46% of the people who participated in the Democratic primary voting for him. And across the ocean, I consulted with Brexit, the forces that were in favor of leaving the European Union. A guy named Nigel Farage was my candidate. And there again, the entire establishment of the country went one way, and the voters went the diametrically opposite way. You saw that again in the country of Colombia, the most like the United States of any of the Latin American countries. And with every politician supporting a peace accord, the voters rejected it because they failed to see the wisdom in taking 10 hardened criminals who had barbarically executed people and giving them seats in Parliament and thereby giving them immunity from prosecution. So people all over the world are taking things in their own hands and distrustful of the establishments of their parties and of their government. They are changing it. And I believe that the Sanders campaign, the Trump campaign, and the Brexit campaign all spring from the same roots, because the world is being taken over by globalism, by a concept that we are one world, that we should all be respectful of every nation casting equal votes, and that's how we ought to be governed. But a lot of people, including me, and I suspect up there Mr. Reagan, say that over half of the nations in the UN are dictatorships. I mean, when Russia casts its vote, he speaks for one person. Ditto with China. When the US speaks, it's for 300 million people, and the votes are counted equally. And there's a wonderful quote from Daniel Harrington, the Enlightenment philosopher in the 18th century. The wisdom of the few may be the wisdom of mankind, but the interest of the few is not the profit of mankind. And I think we're all coming to realize that. And we want a president who is not a colonial governor of America appointed by the UN and the IMF and the World Bank to keep us hostage and candle us and stop us while they continue to run the world. And we do not want to be governed in the interests of the global economy. We want to be governed in the interests of the American people. And the formulations that we're governed under, that started at Bretton Woods, which said the United States would run the world, the dollar would be the currency, our borders would be open, and by free trade we would one by one drag Japan and then Germany and then Singapore and Korea and Thailand and Malaysia out of poverty, and then China out of poverty by giving them access to the American market. And we've been very successful. No anti-poverty program, no foreign aid program has been nearly as successful as capitalism. Of the 6.5 billion people on Earth today, 1.5 billion fewer are poor than were poor 20 years ago. And that's our money making them not poor. But that's not something we can continue to do. Our share of the world has shrunk back to a normal size. We're now about 20% of the world's economy, 5% of the population, or 5%. But basically, we can't continue to carry the entire world on our back. And I think the essence of the Trump candidacy is for the United States president to govern in the interests of the American people, not in the interests of the global economy. And that was also the basis of the Sanders campaign. And that was also the basis of the Brexit campaign. And the world has turned upside down. 90% of Wall Street's money is going to the Democrat in this election cycle. The working class, white working class anyway, is overwhelmingly voting for the Republican. And the college-educated white voter is voting for the Democrat. The rich people are voting Democrat, the poor people are voting Republican. The world has changed. And the Reagan Democrat, the blue-collar worker who understands that the elites of the country are not looking out for him, has switched sides in this election. And it's created a turmoil within the party structure. And it's led to these totally unanticipated results in the primaries, and I think will lead to Trump's victory in this election. Now, I approach this election with a great deal with many credentials. I have two. One is, of course, that I know Hillary Clinton better than anybody else who is not in her inner circle right now, because I was there and basically ran her political career for 20 years. And my father, you may not know this, was Donald Trump's lawyer and represented him when he built Trump Tower, and was his father's lawyer before that. And Donald and my father were very close, and I first met Donald when I was about 20, and he came over to the house for dinner. And I've known him my entire life. So I know these two people very well. And before we get to Hillary, let me just spend a moment on Donald. He is not a racist. He is not a sexist. He is not a bigot. He is not a madman. He's not inflammatory. He's not a demagogue. He's a builder. He's a manager. His goal is to get it done. Stop all the ideology, stop all the debate, just freaking do it. Build it. Get it done. Nike, do it. And his attitude is, don't sit there planning it, don't sit there reworking the theories, make it happen. There's a wonderful line by Felix Rohatyn, who was the U.S. ambassador to France, who said the French respect ideas more than facts, and Americans respect facts more than ideas. So the French say, it doesn't matter if it works or not. What is it? Is it ideologically consistent with Marxism or with whatever economic theory you want? The Americans say, I don't care about the theory. If it works, do it. And I think there's a pragmatism that will run through Donald Trump. And I think his administration will be an extraordinary one. I think that many conservatives may be somewhat disappointed, because I don't think he's going to take Adam Smith any more seriously than he would take Karl Marx. I think he's essentially going to do what works. And I think the United States of America will be an incredibly better country after 4 or 8 years of Donald Trump. And we will look back on the claims that he's a maniac and shoot from the hip and a wild man and can't be trusted with nuclear weapons with exactly the same degree of laughable nostalgia that we remember Jimmy Carter's identical warnings about Ronald Reagan. And I think that they're just as legitimate, and the charges are just as illegitimate. He's not a politician, so he's not used to saying things as he should. If he got up there and he said, which in effect he did, the vast majority of the Mexicans who come to the United States are wonderful, good, hardworking people. But a disproportionate number of them are rapists and drug dealers. And we have to be careful about immigration, lest those bad people come to the country mixed in with the good, or the Muslim immigration. Most are peaceful, but a few of the bad people are mixed in with the good, and we can't necessarily sort them out. And those statements are both true. A quarter of the inmates of federal prisons are illegal immigrants, and they're not in for immigration. They're in for another crime they committed while they're here. And 12% of the inmates of state and federal prisons are illegal immigrants. And illegal immigrants are 1% of our population. So 3% actually. So, you know, it's true, but they take it out of context and they use it to paint him as something that he's not. When he proposes that Japan and South Korea get nuclear weapons, well, the left and the government has always said, oh, nobody should get the bomb, which means the only one that gets the bomb are the nations that hate us. Iran, North Korea, and maybe some others too. The only friendly nations that have gotten the bomb are Britain and France, and that was, you know, 1 million years ago. What is wrong with North Korea knowing that if it hits Tokyo with a nuclear weapon, Japan will wipe it out, even if it meant there would be a further retaliation against Japan? The North Koreans have to wonder if the US would do that. If Tokyo were wiped out and the North Koreans had a missile aimed at LA, would we knock out Pyongyang, the capital? Would we? Would we trade Los Angeles for Seoul or for Tokyo? We don't know. De Gaulle asked, would we trade New York for Paris? And that's why he developed a French bomb, so that there would be no doubt in the mind of the aggressor that an aggression would trigger their own country being wiped out. Mutually assured destruction. Perfectly rational point of view, but blown into a crazy thing about spreading bombs all over the world. So I trust Donald Trump. I think he will be a fine, fine president. And I think it'll be a welcome path above ideology to a very pragmatic approach of doing what works. Now, for Hillary Clinton, the most important thing for me is not how bad she was, but how she has changed and how bad she is. And ditto for Bill. When I knew the Clintons and I worked for them, Bill was not corrupt at all. Hillary was a little corrupt. You know, she looped fast and loose with the cattle futures deal and basically pocketed a $100,000 bribe to let the chicken polluters get off free. And Whitewater, she cut corners she shouldn't have. But it wasn't a career steeped in corruption. And Bill, for his part back then, could care less about money. He absolutely didn't. There was nothing he enjoyed that money brought with it. McDonald's was just fine with him. And they since then have become totally changed people. I think the perks of 10 years in the governor's mansion, of 8 years in the White House, and 4 years in the State Department have gone to their head, and they've become addicted to the kind of luxury that brings with it. And they're determined to have that luxury in their own life, even at the risk of their political career. Back when I knew them, they wanted money, but they wanted money in order to get power. Give me campaign contributions and I'll buy TV time with it so I can get elected. Now they want power so they can make money. Appoint your Secretary of State because I'll get higher speaking fees if I'm the husband of the secretary than if merely I'm a former president. Elect her president, and as the husband of the president, I'll get 10 times the speaking fees. A lot of people say that this is normal. Every politician gets campaign contributions, every politician gets money. But there is a tremendous difference between a campaign contribution and a check in your pocket in your personal bank account. There are 10 or 20 congressmen that have gone to prison over history for misappropriating them, for buying lunch with the money from a campaign contribution, as opposed to spending it on staff salaries and TV ads. You can buy your assistant lunch, but you can't buy yourself lunch. It can't be used for personal activities. And the result is that many, many politicians, Richard Nixon among them, would sit there basically poor, basically borderline insolvent, and handle tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in campaign contributions that he couldn't touch. Hillary has conquered that because these speaking fees are not campaign contributions. They go right into their personal bank account. And this marriage that began as a romance in the 70s and the 80s, turbulent but a romance. I always like to say then, when that Hillary deeply and really loved Bill, and that Bill deeply and really loved Bill. So they had a lot in common. Bill is far too narcissistic for a love affair. But then in the 90s, it became a partnership. We'll govern together. And now it's become a RICO, a racketeering organization. You go around and pass the bag, and I'll go here and I'll do favors. Does Vladimir Putin want to take over 20% of our uranium supply? We'll invite Bill to come to Moscow, give him 1.1 million of speaking fees, put them in the Secretary of State's bank account, and 4 months later, she signs the deal permitting him to do it over the objections of all of her civil service advisors. And the guy who owned the uranium, who bought it on behalf of Putin, bought it and then Putin took over his company, a guy named Justra, gave the library $130 million. The foundation, $130 million. The idea of taking something and calling it a foundation, putting a vignette, putting the code, the patina on it of a foundation and using it as a mechanism for bribery is unique. And kudos to the Clintons for thinking it up, but shame on them at the same time. The Clinton Foundation gives away less than 10% of its revenues in grants. Now they say that's distorted because our philosophy isn't give out money, it's send in workers like the Peace Corps to deal with it. And then they say, well, 80% of your money is for administrative expenses. How much of that is charity and how much is political staff? Oh, you can't see our books. We're not going to let you know that. But the fact of the matter is that the foundation was a holding company for her staff, for her campaign. She didn't want to pay anybody from her campaign money until she actually declared her candidacy, which she delayed until the last minute. They all had been paid by the Clinton Foundation, first by the State Department, and then when that gave up, for 3 years from the foundation, and now from her campaign. And this whole thing is totally, deeply corrupt. Does Algeria want delivery of the jet fighters it bought in the U.S., despite its affinity with ISIS and Al-Qaeda that had led us to hold up the sale? Well, after they gave $400,000 to the Clinton Foundation, the sale was approved and went right ahead. There are so many examples of that. And then Hillary says, where's the quid pro quo? Well, you don't need a quid pro quo. You walk into any third world country and you say, last week I was having lunch with the Secretary of State. And immediately, well, what do you want? You want to take over our cable system, you want the highway system, you want to become our vendor, you want our oil, you want our coal, you can have anything you want because you're on intimate terms with the Secretary of State. There's a wonderful, cute, apocryphal story. In the 1960 campaign, a guy gave John Kennedy $1 million. And Kennedy was really grateful and said, that's just terrific. What can I do for you? And he said, just get the nomination, Jack, and then we'll talk. And Kennedy got nominated, and he called him from Los Angeles and said, I just got the nomination. What can I do for you? And he said, well, I'm sending another $1 million, Jack, but I don't want anything, no cabinet or anything like that. Just get elected. Then he won the election, and Kennedy called him and said, now I'm just sitting down to make out my cabinet, give out the ambassadorships. What do you want? And he said, well, just take office. We'll talk in a few months. Then in March or April, 3 or 4 months later, he called Kennedy. And he said, I'd like you to do me a favor. And Kennedy said, anything you want. And he said, well, I'm going to have lunch at Sans Souci, which at the time was the top restaurant in Washington, 3 weeks from next Tuesday. And I'd like you to come join me at 1 o'clock. He said, well, of course I'll do that, but why don't you come to the White House, eat in the mess here, and I'll take, serve you from the White House. And he said, no, do it this way, Jack. And he said, all right. So he got all of his clients, all of his friends, all of his family, every business prospect he'd ever had, everybody who was working with him, everybody who was important to him, got them all together in the restaurant at noon. And at 1 o'clock, Kennedy came striding in, and he said, not now, Jack, I'm busy. So the quid pro quo works in ways that are sometimes interesting and unusual. The other problem with Hillary, beyond corruption, is that because there is that corruption, there is a Nixonian commitment to secrecy, a Nixonian paranoia, a feeling that if everybody knew who she was, we'd never vote for her, and that therefore it's necessary to keep everything completely silent. Okay. Why did she have a secret email server? So that she could hide the pay-for-play transactions with the Clinton Foundation and the State Department from Freedom of Information. Okay. Why did she have to make that much money? Because Bill was disbarred in the Paula Jones suit and had no other way of making a living. And if he's not going to be an attorney who can legally, in effect, take bribes, he was going to have to do it giving speeches, and you need a foundation to be able to do that. Okay? Why was he disbarred? Well, Paula Jones sued him, and he lied in the deposition, fined $1 million, and disbarred. Well, why did Paula Jones sue him? Because he sexually harassed her, and when she came to Bill and offered to settle the case for no money, no admission of guilt, just settle it, the only thing she wanted was for Bill to say that he sent a state trooper downstairs to fetch her and brought her up to the room. No indication that it was for sex. She was a state worker. He was the governor. Any one of a number of innocuous explanations for that. Hillary refused. Why? Because the American Spectator had just published a story saying that Bill was using troopers to get women, which was true, and Hillary wanted to cover it up, and she couldn't admit that he'd sent a trooper for Paula Jones. And I argued with her for hours, all night long, that if you refuse this, they're going to kill you, because they'll have to put him under oath, and God knows what they'll ask him. Didn't matter. How did it get that far? Well, there was a special prosecutor on the case. How did that special prosecutor come to be on the case? The Washington Post and the New York Times urged it, and they had the clout to do that. Why? Because they both challenged the Clintons to release their tax returns, and if they failed to do so, the papers inferred they had made a killing in Whitewater and it needed to be investigated. Why wouldn't they release the tax returns? These were 1979 and 1980 returns. I begged them to release those tax returns when I was handling their campaign in 80 and 81. Our opponent had released his, and they excoriated us for not doing it. But she kept hers hidden, would never tell me why, and refused to release them. Finally, in 1994, she did release them, and I found out why she didn't. Because they had the evidence of the cattle limitations was still in force, and had to wait 10 years to release it until she could not be prosecuted for the crime. So you see, it all goes back to original sin. You do everything to cover up everything else, to cover up, to cover up, to cover up, until ultimately it becomes such a ball, such a knot, that it destroys you. And that's exactly what happened to the Nixon presidency, and it's what is happening now to the Hillary candidacy. And we should be smart enough to read the handwriting on the wall and not elect her as president. The other point about her is she needs to prove that she's tough and strong. And as such, she's very warlike. The chances of us getting into a war are much greater under Hillary than under Trump. Donald has nothing to prove. Hillary has a lot to prove, a little bit like Margaret Thatcher did in entering the Falklands War. And I think that that's also significant. And there are a whole lot of other reasons I go into in the book. But the key question is, how do we win this race? And I think the way we win it is with the right jab that Republicans always throw, the usual issues, taxes, crime, immigration, social issues, but also the left hook. Also go after the Bernie Sanders voters. 46% of the Democratic electorate voted against Hillary. Go after those voters and bring them over to our side. Ralph Nader, who was a good friend of my wife's, they together founded NIPER, the New York Public Interest Research Group. He recently wrote a book, and I interviewed him about it, called Convergence, where he said the right and the left are converging against the establishment. And he cites all kinds of examples of that. And I believe that's completely true. I believe that the opposition to the global economy is something that the left and the right share. And the aversion to electing someone who has accepted tens of millions of dollars from the biggest banks so much so that she's virtually their employee, that animosity spans party lines and unites both parties in their opposition to it. Let's be clear. The reason that we had a problem in 2007 and 2008 is that federally insured banks made crazy investments with the money we put into them. The reason they could do that was that the law that prevented it had been repealed. The law was called the Glass-Steagall Act. It was passed in 1932. There were two provisions of the bill. One was that banks could only invest money in really safe stuff, like blue-chip mortgages or federally guaranteed loans, treasury notes. And Title II was FDIC, that we would insure deposits with federal money. And Roosevelt and the Congress said, we're not going to insure these deposits unless we can make sure that they don't bet it in Las Vegas. We need them to keep their investments conservative if the taxpayers, in effect, are insuring them. And all during the 7 years of Clinton's presidency, he was constantly confronted by the demand of the banks to repeal Glass-Steagall. And he and I talked about it, and he constantly rejected it. But in 99 and 2000, he gave way. He signed the bill. He repealed that rule. And Goldman Sachs had its IPO the next month and set up the investment unit that ultimately dragged the whole country down with it. And then when Clinton walked out the door of the White House, his first speech was $125,000 from Morgan Stanley. And one after another, speaking fees from the big banks followed. And I believe he was disbarred. He needed something else to do for a living. He knew that the banks would be an essential element of this program of speaking fees and, in effect, bribery that he was setting up. And he signed that repealer as kind of a down payment. He had always been opposed to it, always argued against it, always thought it was just a special interest giveaway, and he was right before, but then wrong when he signed it. And I think that the left understands that too. Why is there income inequality in this country? A huge part of it is illegal immigration. You can't have a wage system where the working class can move up by its labor when there are 13 million people willing to work for almost nothing, and when the manufacturing sector has to be competitive not with American wages, but with Chinese and Thailand wages, keeping the wages way down. Those two elements, foreign trade deals and illegal immigration, have robbed the working class of any of its bargaining in its ability to get wages that are any good. Some say we don't want those jobs, landscaping and hospitality and construction, but that's not true. Over half of those jobs are held by American citizens who want them. What we don't want is the dirt low wages that come with them forced down by foreign competition. It goes back to Abraham Lincoln, who said because he knew that subsistence farming was the equivalent of slow death, and he worked on his father's subsistence farm. They ate what they grew, and they had never had any money. But then he escaped, and he went to work on a riverboat in the Mississippi River. And he writes about his joy at receiving a wage, money, that he could save or spend as he wanted to. And that money eventually lifted him out of poverty. And he understood that wages couldn't work if there were 5 million slaves around who could be forced to work for nothing. And that is why, as a capitalist, he eliminated slavery in addition to the moral concerns. And it's the exact same conundrum that the working class poor find themselves in the United States. And at the same time, the profits are being made by the large entrepreneurs. When you outsource jobs to China, you hire Chinese workers and you fire the American workers. But you're still the owner of the company, and you still get the profits the company is making. And 50% of all of China's exports are on behalf of American companies. They're Ford Motor Company based in China exporting Ford Motor cars. And while the workers are an American, Ford Motors management and stockholders sure as hell are. And 2/3 of the technology exports of China are from American or European-owned companies. So essentially, these bad trade deals are a way of upward redistribution of income within the United States because we're taking money away from the workers and giving it to the management. I don't want to sound like Karl Marx, but you can see how this dovetails the platforms of Trump and Bernie Sanders in a coherent whole. And I think that that's very important. And then, of course, we get to the issue of illegal immigration. The concept that we can vet refugees coming from terror-sponsoring countries is absurd. What are we going to do, call their high school guidance counselor and find out if they got demerits or they were ever suspended from school? We don't even have embassies in these countries, let alone good intelligence, let alone the ability to vet hundreds of thousands of people that want to come into the United States. And if you want to know what happens if you let a lot of them in, look at Belgium and look at France, where these countries are paralyzed by the threat of domestic terrorism. There are huge swaths of the country which are no-go zones. The police don't even go in there. And Sharia law controls those. The courts literally you work there and Sharia law gets enforced. Colonies within the country. And that's what we'll have if we open our borders in the way that the president and Hillary want. Why do they want it? Is it just an excess of humanitarian zeal? Hell no. Those new immigrants vote Democrat. And if they can, right now Muslims have won, increase Muslims to a point where they're like 3%, that's 3 additional points of Democratic votes that will give them election after election victory into the future. So, is to understand the commonality that all people have together in opposing the special interests of the few who are dominating the Hillary Clinton campaign. Now, I believe that in the last debate, Kane, who I thought was awful, if I had to use one word for Kane, it would be supercilious and also boorish. If I had to use one word for Pence, it would be earnest and sincere. And I think it was such a contrast. But when Kane said, is he crazy? The entire immigration system of the United States, since it was set up in 1926, is based on national origin. Each country has a quota, and that quota can't be used by another country. John Kennedy reformed it so it wasn't so oriented in favor of Western Europeans to let in more people from the third world, but it remains a country-based quota. And we used to have a list of countries that sponsored terrorism. It had 7 countries on it. And then Obama decided Cuba had reformed, North Korea had reformed, and Libya had reformed, and took them off the list. The list currently is Syria, Sudan, and one other country, Iran. And then there were also 20 countries that harbored terrorists on that list. That list has been repealed, no longer exists. Saudi Arabia was on it, Yemen, the United Arab Emirates. We need to revive those lists and limit or ban immigration from those countries. We just simply don't need those people. We'll have plenty of immigrants from other places. And what do we do about the heartless treatment of the Syrian refugees? Hey, there are 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. Go join them. Go to Pakistan, go to Bangladesh, go to Indonesia, go to Algeria, go to Morocco. What the hell do you have to come to the United States for?
Hear, hear.
So I think that that's going to be a very potent issue and a real way of opening this campaign. There is something unusual going on. Trump lost the debate on September 26th. He didn't throw the punches he needed to. You can't go through a 90-minute debate with Hillary and never mention Benghazi, and never mention the Clinton Foundation, and never mention emails, and never mention immunity, go through all of that. You can't. If you take those issues off the table, you're not going to beat her. And Trump did. God knows why. I think he was finessed into not wanting to be too aggressive because he wanted to show he had judicial temperament. But that didn't work, and it just pulled all of his punches. So Trump was behind in July and June. Then with his convention at the end of July, he moved up and developed a small lead over Hillary. Then he started making mistake after mistake after mistake. in these random things that he blurted out at 3 in the morning on Twitter, where you can only have 160 characters. And what's in the hand of a character like Donald Trump, it's mischievous. And he fell to 10 points behind because of that and because of Hillary's very skillful convention that gave her a very good bounce. Then Trump got religion. Frankly, he read my book. And if you compare the newspapers of that period with my book, you'll see it's exactly the same. I urged him to use school choice as a way of getting African American votes, so that you pit the parents against the teachers union. And you say that this is the civil rights issue of our time, not to let segregated neighborhoods create segregated schools, and a whole variety of things like that. And he stopped all the crazy comments. And he gained 10 points on Hillary, brought her to a dead even tie. Then the debate came and Hillary won, and Trump dropped to about 5 behind. Then, in the time between the debate and the vice presidential debate, when not much was happening, Trump moved to about 2 behind. And now, with the vice presidential debate, there's some evidence. We only have 2 polls in so far, one showing Trump ahead by 2, the other tied, that Trump at least closed that gap in his tie and maybe even be entering the next debate with a small lead. Why? It's not like he did anything right. He just didn't do anything wrong. But that's the point. In this environment, you need to see what happens when no candidate is pushing it. No candidate is doing things great or terrible that artificially affects the needle. And I believe that Trump has succeeded in 2 fundamental things that I think will bear him to a victory. The first is that I think he has made the clear, self-evident point that if you vote for Hillary Clinton, you must be in favor of continuing the status quo. You must have liked Obama's 2 terms so much that you want a 3rd term, that you want to continue in that direction. And in a country where only 26% of the people say we're on the right track, that's not where you want to be. That's the wrong side of the fence. And Hillary, who cannot disparage Obama and can't really differentiate herself from him without insulting him, and he's a pretty prickly guy, is stuck in that conundrum. How do I say I'm the candidate of change and yet embrace the incumbent administration? The second thing that I think he's done is that fundamentally, Hillary's campaign is a brittle campaign. It's based on a series of insults, a series of words about Donald Trump, quotes from Trump, largely taken out of context. And her whole campaign is that. It's not based on issues. It's not based on proposals, not on votes. It's saying, oh, you can't vote for that guy. Oh, come on, he's beyond the pale. What, you're going to vote for Trump? Are you kidding me? Trump for president? That's the best joke I've heard in years. And once you get past being laughed at, there's nothing left. Once you accept that, yeah, Trump could be president, and a damn good one, and I'm happy to be supporting him, there's nothing left. She has no arguments in reserve. She has no second line of defense. This will be the difference on abortion, or this will be the difference on the economy. She has some issues out there, but not a campaign behind them. And I think that Trump has breached that opening line of defense. And I think that was Mike Pence's contribution to the campaign. Because as Cain repeated himself endlessly, over and over, 6 times talking about the rapists and drug dealer Mexican comment, 5 times talking about cozying up to Putin. By the way, I love that. Trump borrowed some money from Russian bankers. Putin paid Hillary $1.1 million as a bribe to get the uranium deposits, and Trump is the one who's too close to Putin. But I think that once Pence breached those lines and forced Cain simply to repeat them and not amplify them, not explain them, not context them, just to kind of gotcha, I know you said that and I can edit the tape to make clear that you did. And I believe that Hillary has no second line of defense behind that. And so Hillary is really trying to push a rock up a hill. And the momentum of the country's desire for change is squarely in the rock that wants to roll down the hill. And I think that you can see that in the polling of the last few days. And I think that that may continue. Now, if Trump screws up the next debate and pulls punches, you can't count on that, because you need constantly to remind people about this issue. You know, he's got to stop waiting for some reporter to say, as the debate question, would you comment on Benghazi? It's never going to happen. They'll ask him about the smallest refugee camp in Syria, but they'll never mention the word Benghazi. Or, would you have any comments about the Clinton Foundation? They're never going to ask that. So what you've got to do is take the existing question and turn it around to be that and answer that and make that an important part of the campaign. If Hillary Clinton were honest, if Hillary Clinton were open, if Hillary Clinton were truthful, she would win this election easily. It is that she's not that is why she's losing. And when you go into a debate with her, you got to remind the country that she's not. And that gives you a very good chance, and I think a likelihood, of winning this election. So I'd be happy to take questions and comments and everything, and please.
So we have staff members with microphones. Please wait for a microphone because we are live streaming and we want to ensure that we capture your voice. So we'll start right here.
So Laura Simon says he worked for Bill. And Sherry Lee says Hillary will never be honest. These are the comments coming in from my selfie. Thanks, Laura.
We've all heard Trump say, and many other people are suggesting that...
Where are you?
Right here.
Oh, yeah, okay.
That the presidential election is a fixed fight, that no one's being elected, that someone's already been selected. I'd like your views on that.
No, that's nonsense. It's a perfectly winnable election. People have talked about the Electoral College lock, and the Republicans are under a slight disadvantage there, but not anything major. If the Republicans lose the popular vote by, if the Republicans win the popular vote by less than half of 1%, it's possible the Democrats will win the election in the Electoral College, just like Bush did against Gore. But beyond that, it just isn't true. The interesting thing over the last 3 or 4 days or week is that while Trump has done badly since the first debate, 5 points down nationally before he's changed lately, he still is carrying Ohio by 5. And Pennsylvania, which a Republican never had a prayer of, he's losing that by only 3. And I think that is showing a blue-collar, working-class strength. Joe the plumber is voting for us. And I think that that's very good. Now, on the question of ballot fraud, which is, I guess, behind your question, there will be a lot of it, but there has to be so much in a country of 150 million votes to really do it. But lest anyone question that it's happening, North Carolina got together with the other states and got 26 of them, the red states, together, and said, let's share our voting records from the 12 election, and in another state on the same day. The same date of birth as another person in another state. And what happened, of course, is that I moved, let's say, from New York to North Carolina, and I didn't call up the Board of Elections and cancel my registration. You know, you don't do that. You just don't vote, and after a while they get the point. But what happens is that I moved to North Carolina, and I vote there, and then somebody walks up, maybe with an illegal immigrant, and says, he's Dick Morris, he's here to vote. And the registrar can't say, let me see some photo ID, because that would have a deleterious effect on the franchise. So he votes. And that's how 75,000 votes got stolen in a state that John McCain carried by less than 75,000. So there is a good chance of that happening. But if Trump wins, we'll get photo ID, and I think that will probably stop it. And I don't see the race being that razor close.
Gentleman right here.
Hi.
Did you ever think that Trump would run for president?
Did I ever think Trump would run for president? Yeah, once I did, 4 years ago. I had a whole series of meetings with him to brief him on issues. And then when he didn't, I was pretty disgusted with him because I'd wasted all that time. But I did have a good line for him. I said he should begin his campaign with an ad that said, Barack Obama, you're fired.
Right here.
Thanks for coming down tonight.
Thank you.
I guess if anybody could really advise, are you advising Mr. Trump and Mike Huckabee, advising Mr. Trump on how to respond to Hillary's attacks and her traps? Because Huckabee's a master at that.
Yeah. Am I advising Donald Trump? Not privately, not personally, but I've decided that what I'm going to do is scream my advice at the top of my lungs. And in addition to 200 million people, Trump will probably hear it. We've sold 150,000 copies of that book, and Trump probably has a few. And I felt that that would be the best way of doing this. And there's no advice that I would give him that I won't give in public. I sent out an email today to my list. I have 500,000 people who get columns and stuff. How many people get them here? Okay? Every day I put out a lunch alert. That's a video where I talk about the issues. Just go to dickmorris.com and sign up, and I'll send it to you each day. Tomorrow says that if the hurricane hits in Florida, Trump has got to talk about the importance of overcoming carbon emissions by more natural gas, which has half the carbon potential of coal, and by sequestration, burying carbon dioxide so it doesn't affect the atmosphere. And it would be a mistake to take a hardline position on that at this point that Hillary could use to beat him with. And I go through answers to the questions I think he might get. So I do that kind of stuff all the time. And I tuck him in before I go to bed, but I don't ever touch him.
One here in the front row.
Could you speak on Hillary Clinton's health? And also, does she have a double? It seemed like when she came out of her daughter's apartment that day, that she came out without Secret Service or anything and just sort of pulled around. What do you know about that?
Yeah. I don't know anything about either of those, but I do believe this. We've had a president who was disabled, and he served well for 12 years, FDR. But we've never had a president who had mental problems, who had dementia. And with 5 incidents that we know of fainting in the last 5 years, 4 of them in public, and with a blood clot diagnosed between her brain and her skull, I think Trump should call on her in the next debate to take an MRI and release the results publicly, because I think we're all entitled to know that.
There's a gentleman there in the second row.
Yeah, I'm just curious, just to dovetail on this gentleman's question, what type of advisement Trump is getting and what your awareness of that advisement is as specific as possible?
He's got a wonderful group around him of very good people who are very experienced. Rudy Giuliani, prominent among them, Mike Huckabee, a whole variety of good folks. The problem is Donald Trump. He's very arrogant. He's very conceited. He believes that he knows it all. And frankly, it takes bad poll numbers to convince him he doesn't. And it took his losing 10 points at the end of July to realize that he doesn't know it all. And now he screwed up the debate, and I hope he's learning his lesson from that. So, Emil Ludwig, the historian, once wrote a book about Napoleon, where he said Napoleon knew better than all of his generals and had insights that his generals didn't have that enabled him to win all of these wars. But then when it came to the fundamental things that generals do know about, like wearing winter uniforms in Russia, he didn't listen to him. And as a result, he was defeated. And I think that's true of Trump. At a time when nobody thought he could win, he won. At a time when everybody said you can't say that, he did, and he won anyway, or because of it. But that doesn't mean that he gets it right all the time. And I think he's gradually learning that. I think it's a learning curve, and a week ago I was more optimistic, but he hasn't done anything stupid in 3 days, so maybe.
So we have time for 2 more questions. This gentleman right here.
I think, like me, most of you are voting age. And I'm just wondering, who needs another college called the electoral. But
Yeah.
why do we need that?
Yeah, well,
Since we're voting,
yeah. Well, we have it, and we're not going to change it. So let me take other questions, though, about this current situation. I agree with you. It's an anachronism, but it's how we came together as a country.
This lady right here. Hi, I'm a mother of an officer in the military, and I just
Good for you.
Thank you. I just have a question about, I've heard and gone to other speakers and heard about Hillary Clinton's dislike of the military. And I just was wondering if you could address that, because it affects all of us, and it also affects military morale.
I think she did hate the military as a legacy of her Vietnam era activities. And I think that she still is suspicious of people in uniform. And I think that plays itself out in her attitude on the Black Lives Matter police controversies. In terms of disliking the military, it's hard to believe, because she's been through so much in which they've done so much. But regardless of her personal opinion, what's important is to understand that she and Obama will put everything else ahead of doing what needs to be done militarily. Why didn't she reinforce Benghazi? Because she didn't want it to look like Iraq, with a lot of American soldiers, and make it an American war, because she felt it would alienate the Libyans and lead to another Iraqi situation. So she decided not to, even though it would risk the lives of the men and ultimately resulted in at least 2 of the 4 deaths, and perhaps all 4. Other things just keep getting in the way. Why is she not effectively vetting immigrants that come to the United States? Well, her perceptions of the Constitution come into play, and her spirit of fair play and all of that. Everything comes first. She always thinks of a reason for not doing something. And the result is that we are markedly less safe. Let me give you a good example. When Obama and now Hillary speak of killing bin Laden, the Clintons had the best chance to kill bin Laden in 1998, before 9/11. The irony is, had they done so, we would never have known what a wonderful thing they did, because we'd never heard of him. We just read an item on page A38. And the Republicans bear some complicity in why it didn't happen, because he was planning to strike bin Laden, and when he struck the aspirin factory and the other factories that in retaliation for one of the terror attacks on our embassy in Kenya, people said, "You're wagging the dog. You're doing this to distract attention from Monica Lewinsky." And that really nettled with him. So on the day that Lewinsky had her grand jury testimony, he got the best intelligence you could ever get of where bin Laden was. And it turned out he was there, and we would have killed him. And at the last minute, Bill scotched the operation, and the CIA guys almost wept. They said, if we ever had actionable intelligence, this was it. He was in the building. He wasn't going anywhere. He couldn't really leave because everybody else was there. And we could have killed him, and we didn't. And I think that could come out in the debate. Everything else comes ahead. You don't want collateral damage. You don't want people to say you wag the dog. You don't want to kill a civilian. We get this from wiretap, we shouldn't have. Everything comes first, beyond doing the job. It's the way the left governs.
Thank you. I think that's all we have time for. Because
Well, let's get this gentleman here.
you want one
Yeah,
more, okay?
black polo shirt.
Wait for the microphone if you would.
I have a question about your analysis of the battleground states, and which states do you think are going to be the ones that put Donald Trump ahead?
What's the electoral map in the battleground states? If Trump wins the same states that Romney won, which includes North Carolina, that's a little iffy, but I think we'll be okay there. And Georgia, which was iffy, but now it's not. I did it with Indiana. If he wins all of the Romney states, we're about 70 electoral votes shy, about 60 electoral votes shy of what we need. Then in Florida, Obama won the election by 4.1%. So you first look at the states that Obama carried with less than 4.1%, because if he gets to the same place that Romney got, he'll probably carry those states. Florida, we lost by 9/10%, and Ohio, we lost by 1.5%. And I think that if we win nationally by 1 or 2 or 3 points, we inevitably are going to carry those states. Probably more likely Ohio than Florida, because we're doing very well in industrial blue-collar areas. Then you come to the rest of the country, and we need to pick up 19 electoral votes. The conventional wisdom says Virginia would be the easiest, which is 13, and Iowa, which is 8, might be the next easiest, and Colorado, which is, I think, 8, might be easy as well, or might be doable as well. But those are all states that Obama carried by more than 5 points. So we would need to do better than better in those states. But what we're noticing is that there were a whole lot of areas that never used to be in play, that were not in play for Mitt Romney, but are in play for Trump, like Pennsylvania, and like Michigan, and like Wisconsin. And it's important to remember that in 2004, Karl Rove and George Bush brought out 10 million new white voters that had never voted before, and they voted for Bush and he won. Then in 2008, Obama brought out 10 million black, Latino, and young voters that hadn't voted before, and he won. Then in 2012, the 10 million whites stayed home, and that would have given Romney the margin of victory. And they stayed home either because they were religious conservatives who didn't trust a Mormon, or they were working class people of the sort I've described who didn't trust the global economy and didn't trust someone who would do mergers and acquisitions and throw them out of work. And Romney became not an entrepreneur, but an investor and a takeover artist, and it really hurt him. Now, I think Trump is going to bring back those 10 million voters. Then I think that he has successfully appealed to the African-American vote, not so he will increase his vote share much. It was 8%, it was 4%. It'll probably raise up to 16, but that's not worth much. But the point is that the black vote in 2004 was 11% of the vote, with no increase in population disproportionate to the national increase. The black vote went from 11 to 13% with Obama running both times. And of the 4 points that Romney lost by, 2 of them were those extra black points, the 2 extra percent that cast that. If you roll it back to 11%, which I think Trump is doing, Hillary's not that popular and Trump is not that fearful. They're trying to resurrect the birther issue to make it seem as if he's horrible, or extracting something his father did 30 years ago in building housing projects. But I don't think that's going to work, and I think that the black turnout will drop back toward 11, and I think we'll pick up those 2 points. We'll pick up the 10 million new people that we can bring into the electorate that left last time. And then I think we will be very successful in bringing out a lot of new voters that have never voted. Remember that in the primaries, on the last poll, right before Election Day, Donald Trump always polled 5 points worse than he actually got in the election. If the last he got 40. Always 5 points that didn't poll that came out for him. And a lot of people feel that people were ashamed to say they're going to vote for Trump because of Hillary's shaming. Some people say that it's a methodological problem. You ask someone, are you likely to vote? He says, vote? Hell no, I haven't voted in 35 years. And then the day before the election, he pays attention and says, hey, I like this Trump guy, I think I'll vote for him. And he wasn't counted in the poll, but he's a last-minute decider of a marginal voter. One quick way to understand that is, let me see a show of hands. How many of the men in this audience do your Christmas shopping in September and October? Okay? Now, how many of the women in this audience do your Christmas shopping in September and October? Okay? Now, we can run Christmas ads till we're blue in the face in September and October, and all of you will hear it, but it won't mean a damn thing to any of the men because they're not up to buying Christmas presents. But we'll reach the women, and then on December 24th, the women won't care because they already bought everything, but the men will be desperately flipping the dial for ideas to buy something before the next day. And then it'll really work. That's like the downscale voter. People in this room follow the election early, make up their mind, who is largely a Trump voter, only makes up his mind at the end, only pays attention at the end. Another quick way to understand it is women following the Super Bowl. You know, when they have to buy the potato chips for the party, they learn who's playing. The men have followed it since spring training. And that's another example, switching it. So I think that Trump is going to do even better than he's polling. Well, thank you. Goodbye and good night.